Please remember to like, subscribe, and rate on your favorite podcast platform.
Trigger warning. This podcast contains discussion of emotional, physical, and sexual abuse, and includes explicit language. Listener and viewer discretion is advised.
Somatic means body-oriented, and experiencing is a verb. So it is the experience of the body in the present moment. In our work, the healing happens in the here and now.
If I survived something terrible, I did something right. If I did it right, I will do it again until that reflex gets interrupted. And that's one of the beauties of somatic experiencing. It gently in a modulated way interrupts that survival reflex so that someone can come out of surviving and into thriving. Trauma is not a life sentence.
Without healing, traumatic experiences can have an enormous impact on defining who we are and who we will become.
Wade Robson and myself, James Safechuck, are both survivors of childhood abuse. In this podcast, we're talking with survivors, trauma specialists, and advocates,
highlighting the many resources available in order to inspire the brave steps to starting or continuing the healing journey.
This is From Trauma
to Triumph.
Welcome to our podcast, From Trauma to Triumph, with myself, James Safechuck, and Wade Robson. In this episode, we discuss the somatic experiencing therapeutic technique with two incredible guests, Dr. Abi Blakeslee and Dave Berger.
Somatic experiencing, SE for short, is a body-oriented therapeutic technique for healing trauma and other stress disorders. It's the life's work of Dr. Peter A. Levine and has been clinically applied for more than 4 decades.
Dave Berger has over 40 years experience as a physical therapist, somatic psychotherapist, and bodyworker. He uses a diverse array of traditional and complementary healing practices to help clients with physical pain and movement problems, trauma histories, back and neck problems, PTSD, and anxiety disorder. Dave is a certified somatic experiencing practitioner, consultant, and senior teacher of long-term training.
Dr. Abi Blakeslee integrates somatic experiencing with clinical research, the psychobiological principles of attachment, psychodynamic therapy, and somatic bodywork in her practice and teaching. Dr. Blakeslee holds a Master's of Arts in counseling and depth psychology and a Ph.D. in clinical and somatic psychology. She works with individuals, couples, children, and families, and treats a broad base of issues. Somatic experiencing has been a really important aspect of my own personal healing journey. So we were really excited to have this conversation and now to share it with you guys. Dave and Abi, thank you so much for being with us today. It's an honor, a privilege to have you here.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Ladies first, maybe we'll start with you, Abi. If you could try and give us, what is this simple introduction to somatic experiencing?
So an elevator pitch for somatic experiencing, I like to start with the definition, which somatic means body-oriented, and experiencing is a verb. So it is the experience of the body in the present moment. And one of the powers of that is that in our work, the healing happens in the here and now. And we're particularly interested in what's happening in somebody's what we call physiology or their nervous system. And so as somebody might be sitting with you, you might ask them, what are you noticing in your body right now? Conscious awareness of bodily sensation. So that may be available, it may not be available, but many people at a resting state, right? Like right now, I feel engaged. I feel excited. There's a little bit of uptick as I'm sharing with you, as I'm meeting you both for the first time, but there's a warmth. I feel really happy to be here, to be sharing information that sort of spreads across my chest. My legs feel grounded. Dave Berger and I have known one another for over 20 years, as we were saying. So there's this nice warm familiarity or softening that I feel as I look at him. So those would be internal states, right? I was talking about sort of a relational moment here with the listeners as well. But you also might feel nervous or afraid or stressed. So we call stress physiology. And that could be in relationship to now or some kind of past event, some survival physiology imprint that's all dressed up with nowhere to go. And then we really want to try to work with that imprints of fight, flight, freeze, stuckness, sort of it's the memory, but it persists in the body. And we have some tools and techniques to help people to release that and to reorganize that and kind of return back into a sense of relaxed readiness. And then they have more availability for their life energy, their purpose, their sense of being in the world. Dave, do you have an elevator pitch?
Well, it depends on how tall a building we're in and how long an elevator ride is. Partly also who's the audience in the elevator. So I will verbalize it a little bit differently to different people. Sometimes I'll keep it very, very simple, like we're helping people who live in the past because of PTSD rewire their brain and catch up to the present moment. And that happens, like Abi was saying, in the here and now, in the body, in the physiology, as well as in the psychology and the relationships. Sometimes if it's a long elevator ride and I'm speaking with somebody who has more science background, I'll go into more detail about how the physiology functions, how the nervous system functions, what gets disrupted because of trauma experiences in the past, whether it's shock trauma, relationship trauma, war, military, pervasive trauma, etc. But the bottom line really is that we want to help people catch up and be in the present moment and out of the past moment. That the past becomes an informant, but not a life sentence on them.
And trauma has this like disconnect between the mind and body that happens with trauma. And is somatic experiencing a way to connect those two together?
Yes and no. So yes, that there can be this split. I don't feel my body in the present moment now. I feel it's as if it's then. And oftentimes not at all, because I've dissociated out of my body. And so my thought processes and my emotions, if that's what we want to refer to as the mind, might be now, but heavily influenced by the past. Whereas when someone does come into a more rewired nervous system and in the present, the mind body is functioning more in what we call coherence, more flow and ease in the present moment. And someone's more aware of that and what's happening now.
I'd look at that question too from a societal standpoint. You know, there's been a long history of disconnection between mind and body. And it's as if the brain and the intellect runs the show. We talk about memory circuits like explicit memory. So that's sort of your autobiographical memory, the sense of who you think you are in a timeline, the semantic or verbal memory, how you tell stories about your life. So much of that drives who we think we are. But we have what we call implicit memory. These are unconscious and non-conscious ways that we remember things. So our body will remember, for example, how to lift up a coffee mug, right? Or to ride a bike, or to emotional memory, right? Things that get paired together as being threatening or safe, some approach and avoid. All of that, so much of that runs the show. But we don't tend to give acknowledgement to that, those aspects of who we are, which are deeply interwoven. So there's been an ongoing kind of split, I think, for not all cultures, but in many cultures, where the mind and the body are separate. So we think of trauma, we think of, the psychological or the behavioral kinds of things, right? The thoughts people have, suicidal ideation, or maybe anxiety or avoidance versus what's actually happening in their system, right? That is creating some of those signals that is keeping them feeling afraid or shut down in a freeze response. So these would be other things that we definitely encourage people slowly sometimes, because it can be very overwhelming to return to the felt sense, right? Little by little, engaging that and then being able to return to a sense of regulation. But I think culturally that's been going on for a very long time. And we have kind of like cognitive behavioral therapy that fights with somatic or body oriented therapy. And everyone kind of wants a seat at the table. But we don't get in somatic oriented work a lot of recognition still. We're still kind of clambering our way into and getting more and more evidence based. But it's hard to study because the body isn't linear. Right. It's not like you can just do that and do that over and over again. And then we're gonna prove how we can help people.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a long-winded way to say, yes, there is a split, but it's also on a much larger level that's been sort of philosophically continues. And we hope with this kind of work that we invite people to get more curious about what they're experiencing in any given moment.
We're fascinating creatures. We've managed to survive for a long time, but not necessarily thrive. And Abi was talking about the implicit memory. Most of a human being functions through this. Our heart rate, insulin being secreted by our pancreas, our ability to go into fight or flight when we need to, and to shut down so we don't feel anything when we need to. And we maintain that until we really do catch up into the present moment. So sort of a common denominator, a least common denominator is, if I survived something terrible, I did something right. If I did it right, I will do it again until that reflex gets interrupted. And that's one of the beauties of somatic experiencing. It gently in a modulated way interrupts that survival reflex so that someone can come out of surviving and into thriving in the present day.
Can sometimes people, it's kind of this feedback loop between your thoughts and the body, and sometimes triggers happen in the body before you're consciously aware of it, and then that sort of triggers anxiety thoughts, and then sometimes thoughts trigger the body to react, and you can't quite tell where they come from. Sometimes they come from the body before you think it in their mind. Can somatic experiencing help with this, or have you found that happens?
Well, you just gave the perfect antidote explanation to what you were asking in the prior question. There is no split. It's what is emphasized or de-emphasized. And yeah, we work at all levels. We work at a cognitive level, a body level, emotions, what happened before in our memories, what's happening now in our affect, our emotions. Yeah. So and these all get split apart, or many of them may not function as coherently as they can when someone's been traumatized. And we do that to prevent all our circuits from getting blown, right? We split them apart. So part of the function of somatic experiencing is to help bring those back together so that there is more access to and flow between all of those elements. So I can have a thought, my body's going to react, or I might hear a loud sound, my body reacts, and then I realize I'm scared, and then I get the thought, oh, that car could have hit me, that person could have attacked me. Right? But the physiology, the body's going to react first, because thinking just takes too long under high stress environments.
Right.
I have another thought, and it's great to riff with Dave. We can kind of enter these questions from many different kinds of levels. But let's say that I'm walking along in the grocery store and it's busy day, or Trader Joe's that I miss so much. It's a busy day. And then there's a couple of shopping carts that are going past me. And then all of a sudden I notice that my heart is pounding and I'm starting to feel some cold sweats. And then I think, why am I feeling this way? Why am I jittery? Oh, it's a cumulative stress. Or, oh, I just remembered that I forgot something. Or I'm feeling really bad about the performance that I did at work the other day. So I might try to mentalize, what is this experience that I'm having? Now, in an SC-oriented session, if I were sitting with myself or that person, I would say, as you remember being in Trader Joe's in the supermarket, what are you noticing in your body right now? So it's past, right? But they're remembering the stress response. They say, well, I can feel my heart rate is beating really fast right now. And I'm not sweating quite as much, but I'm starting to feel chilled. I'm starting to feel shaky. So we have a couple of choices there. We could stay with the feeling of the shakiness and see if maybe they start to shake or tremble. That's one of the ways that animals release stress. Humans do too. Or maybe it feels like it's too much. It's sort of elevating. The heart rate is getting faster and faster, this constriction. We could have them orient around the room, maybe feel their solidity of their legs, if their legs feel warm and connected. And then usually what will happen is that the nervous system, given time to move through the stress response without us interrupting it or going away, it will begin to release, just like an animal will release stress physiology, survival physiology in the wild. They can't stay in freeze or they'll be eaten. They've got to have a mechanism to come out of it. Or maybe I start to feel trembly. I notice the trembles in my arms and then my legs. I start to feel then cold turns to heat, and that spreads through my body, and I take a deeper breath. So I've been through a kind of a cycle of a reduction of some of that. And then I might ask a question like, as you think about that, what is it about that moment, do you think, that why that fear arousal or that response? Let's let go of all of the thoughts for a moment. It could have been the performance, but as you kind of get a sense on that side of your body, and then they say, I have a flash. That's the side that I was abused, right? The person came through the door that my bedroom was facing in this direction. And so when that person, that it was also that sound, I can remember the sound of the wheel, that scuffling sound. And I think that's probably what's starting to come up. I'm feeling afraid, or I'm feeling mobilized. Sympathetic mobilization in order to defend and protect would be another thing. So it might not always discharge. It also might turn into some kind of a response that the body is still primed to make. So that would be a trigger that they would begin to notice a lot of the time we find that through the felt sense, though. As I feel into this side and I remember the carts, oh, now I have that, either that memory or that sense that is paired to a specific event.
Right. Sometimes you're not mentally cognizant of the relationship between the trauma and your present moment. Your body feels it first. You can go, all right, there's something happening here, and begin to notice that.
You mentioned, Abby, you brought up the animals and how animals process trauma. And as I understand, the studying of animals was a large component in developing somatic experiencing. So either one of you, if you want to talk about just that, maybe the differences, and we talked about the intellectual processing versus the body processing, the difference between how animals who are dealing with, a level of stress in the wild that every moment, every day that most of us couldn't imagine, humans, but they seem to have a different way of continuing to thrive through that.
Yes, it's more rare that a wild animal will become traumatized and fall into a trauma response over time than human beings. Now, wild animals do get traumatized, but by and large, considering they could be anybody's dinner at any moment, they don't. And the idea behind that is that they don't interrupt, or there is not an interruption in the whole physiological process that needs to happen to metabolize and shed or discharge, we'd say in SE, all the survival energy of fight and flight. So they may, a wild animal might be chased for some distance, or it could be very short distance. And so they're in a flight mode. If you can't fight, run. It's probably better to run first, but they run. And at a certain moment, they have a knowing, not a cognitive knowing, to go into shock, to shut down. And what that does is oftentimes it will stop the chase. That predators often need the stimulation of the chase to increase the appetite. And once that animal, the prey animal, is in shock, now it's got all this sympathetic nervous system energy, the adrenaline and all this whole biochemistry inside of it, but it's now shut down. It's like, I'm running, I'm putting the gas on, and now I'm going to slam on the brakes to let the predator know I'm actually dead. I'm actually pretending I'm dead. I'm feigning death. It's a shock state, thanatosis. And once the coast is clear, whether it's by smell or visual, other means that the prey knows the predator is left, then they slowly, and this is all what we were talking about earlier, implicit memory, it's not a cognitive process, they will slowly come out of this shock state. They may shake, they may tremor, they'll salivate, nasal secretions, they'll heat up, and what seemed like death is no longer death. They come back out of that state and then eventually shake it all out. You'll see an animal shake and tremor. Even a domestic animal will shake and tremor after the door is knocked. No, it's just you. You're boring. I know who you are, right? They shake it out and then they go back to sleep. Well, a wild animal will do the same. They'll shake it out and mobilize and move along in a simplified form explanation. Dr. Levine's idea behind that is that if they can complete that physiological cycle and not get stuck in a trauma response with that gas and the brake running, or one more than the other, but it comes back more into balance and into flow, then they're prepared for the next go around. But they're not stuck. They're in the present moment. And that's the key to it. In the present moment, having shed, discharged, metabolized the biochemistry associated with that flight response and that shutdown response, right? And humans have the same capacity to do that, only we are wonderful at interrupting ourselves by need, by necessity, by internalized messaging, or others interrupt us from completing that process. And that's a much more complicated situation, and many variations of that theme.
Do we just get lost in our thoughts to allow the body to go through that process? Or is it like the parts of the brain that humans have that other animals don't have?
Parts of it can get lost in our thoughts. Parts of it, we've internalized messages: don't shake, don't tremor, don't show your fear. Parts of it, we might have to, by medical necessity, get shut down. So if I've been in a horrific fight or car crash, and I'm brought to the emergency department, and they need to anesthetize me, or my brain will swell, right? Then I have to be shut down, and have not been able to go through that entire physiological cycle. So there are many reasons. It might be historic trauma that the messaging carried forward is shut down, don't say anything, things could get worse, right? So it gets very, very complex when it comes to human beings not being able to complete that cycle.
Now, do you think some of that, with human beings sort of halting or interrupting that cycle, is some of that learned? Meaning, are children, I don't want to say the word better, but can it be easier or more natural for children who have maybe experienced a traumatic event to move through it, move through that whole cycle without stopping the process cognitively?
I would say that there's a pretty strong conditioned response in modern society to not sense yourself at the full level that you can, as well as our unfamiliarity with the involuntary. So, for example, if I say, okay, I'm going to move my arms, and I'm going to think about, I'm going to move my arms. Maybe I do a yoga pose or something. So I'm moving my arms. I'm telling my arms, move. Instead of, what's the feeling of my body of how my arm wants to move? And so those who are watching, you can see I have a very different kind of way. My arm is kind of just doing something interesting. I'm like, that's really interesting how my arm is moving. It's wanting to do that. I'm following more of the involuntary. So let me say this. A lot of the times kids, because I have 3 kids, and they are a little bit closer through their sense of play, through their sense of curiosity. If you ask them to kind of move their awareness, I say, let it come up from the automatic, or I'll say something like, let the shaky happen. Somebody falls, or let's say they fall off of a slide, right? And I say, oh, you're in freeze for a while. Just take some time and we'll wait until your body comes out of it on its own. So you can teach kids, but you can teach adults as well. Sometimes adults are a little more resistant, right? Because they've been doing something for a longer time one way. But once people usually get the experience of feeling that release, and that they're able to do it on their own, it really can reset some of that accumulated stress, trauma, physiology. It can reset them at the kind of base of the thermostat. One of the things I wanted to mention to just kind of really, Dave, I really enjoyed your description of a lot of the threat response cycle and animals and nature. And one other thing that we see when we work with people are these impulses. So in any threatening situation, whether it's abuse, whether it's a car accident, right? Our mind it is kind of processing on many levels, but our body will mobilize in order to defend and protect. And sometimes we'll have conflicting impulses, like I want to run away, right? But I can't, the wall is here. Or I want to run away, but these are the adults who are supposed to be taking care of me. Or I feel safe and in danger, right? When there's an attachment dilemma. So I want to move towards, but I also want to move away. Something feels good, but something doesn't feel good here. Something feels scary, but something also, right? There's this kind of feeling internally of what we would call a survival response. And those are out of the freeze and more into action or action potential. And for a lot of people, stress physiology is that kind of stuck fight or flight or attachment dilemma, approach, avoid. Yeah. And some of the felt sense or the signaling in the body that goes with that. So we often work with what is the movement that wants to happen in the present moment? What's the part that wants to approach? What's the part that wants to retract? What's the signal that says, no, this doesn't feel good? What's the kind of the reclamation of, let's say, if we're talking about where there's been sexual abuse or any kind of attachment trauma, right? Where there's some part of it too, where you're like wired to connect with your caregivers for your survival. And they're aspects of somebody that you love, but there's also a feeling of, I'm being harmed, or this isn't right, or something, right? And that might take time to kind of begin to emerge, right? Or this hurts, or I'm overwhelmed. But it's beginning to kind of also recognize, okay, my body can have these natural feelings of love and connection, maybe even pleasure and goodness, and that's mine. I own that, right? And I can sense and I can feel into that and kind of reclaim that, be with that. And there's this part of me that also has that, and my fist is going to the center of my body of the boundary. No, that's not right. That retraction back, the protect the heart protect the body, curl in, push away, run hopefully to a competent protector, be a bear, right? There might be a fight response, like, so I'm kind of, or growling, but those are things too, where we want to help people to feel into the completion of the defensive strategies. And that might be exploring some of the different signals that came up in any given situation. But what's important is that as they remember that situation, they're feeling into what's happening in their body now. It's not the memory of what happened then. It's, as I think about that, I have this constriction. Stay with the constriction. Well, there's this movement forward and a movement away at the same time. Right? You can stay in the dilemma, the somatic dilemma, and see what emerges. Or you could say, choose one direction to start with. And let's begin, we call it coupling dynamics, things that are stuck together. Let's uncouple those, pull those apart, and let your body do those actions that it wanted to do, that it was inhibited to do, to complete that. And then all of this survival physiology, Dr. Levine says, it's all dressed up with nowhere to go. There's this feeling of, I couldn't then, but I can now. Mm-hmm. I can set a boundary now. I can be a bear. I can feel my authentic feelings of pleasure and know that they're mine, right? And that this is good that I feel that. Like there's an uncoupling or a disconnect from shame or freeze around that.
When you were talking about the complications, attachment and love, like if you have attachment and love that goes along with the trauma, does that complicate it rather than somebody who is in a car crash doesn't have those components? You just address it. It is, or maybe you could talk about it more. Do you approach it differently when you have all those other factors that are part of the trauma?
Yes and no, in terms of how we approach it. Do we approach it differently or the same? The yes, in that we want to help someone feel their presentry little by little, because too much can be overwhelming. So that's whether it's a shock trauma or attachment trauma or larger social cultural trauma. It can be just as overwhelming as the earlier trauma experiences. But no, it's more complex than a one-time shock trauma. It's much more complex. And Abi gave a great description of her own children and the environment that she, and I'll add, and her husband hold around allowing, shake it out or move it through that container. When children are traumatized early on, when children grow up in environments where the folks they're supposed to be able to go to for consoling, for helping their systems become regulating, self-soothing, we're not born with that ability. We develop that over time in relationship to the adults around us. When those people are the perpetrators, are the agitators, are the creators of anxiety and fear, then it becomes very, very confusing, not just for the child, but for the child's nervous system, their physiology, and it can't learn how to self-soothe. We are wired to do that. We're hardwired to be able to do that, but it's a maturation process that happens in a dance with adults who respond, the environment that we live in, the family environment, the social environment, the cultural environment. So while it would seem like, oh yeah, children should be able to do that naturally, because we're naturally able to do that and it should be simpler, it's not. It becomes much more complicated, and the environment doesn't allow for that maturation process.
Yeah.
And if you
James and I can both relate to that one.
Quite a lot. Right.
To that. Yeah. So here's an exercise to do.
Yeah.
Very simple. Allow your tongue to soften. Just really let it kind of ooze to the floor of your mouth. And notice what happens down through the middle of your body. Well, you stay present just to feeling your body. And then in SE, we would ask, what are you noticing right now?
My gut got relaxed a bit.
Yeah, there was a sort of a dropping and an expanding.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly. So as Abi and I we're talking about children, we're talking about all these complex things. Your ears are hearing it. That's this present moment sensation, and your bodies are reacting, right? So interrupt, I gave a top-down directive, thought process down, and your bodies both came back into the present moment. Nobody told you relax your gut, right? Your body knew how to do it on its own, given a very small invitation.
Abi, you referenced empowerment a few times, and just how important that feeling of empowerment is for trauma recovery. I know it is for me, feeling empowered and gaining your strength or finding your strength. There's no question there, but just resonated with me.
There's empowerment, and there's the felt sense and the experience of feeling empowered. So, there's the thought of empowerment, and then there's the experience. And one of the things when I'm with someone, so we might be exploring boundaries, for example. So we'll have a somatic exercise where you have one person standing on one side of the room, and then the practitioner is standing on the other side of the room. And they say, when if it's okay with you, what I'd like to do is start moving towards you. And when you feel something, let me know. And so they go, okay, this sounds like an interesting exercise. Let's give it a try. And so then you start to move towards. And it's very interesting to watch what happens. For some people, they won't feel anything until you're very close. For some people, you just start to take a step forward and they say, okay, right? And they say, what are you noticing in your body? I feel constriction in my chest. Let's just take some time with that. I usually rock back on my back foot. They notice the tension. They stay with that for a while. Maybe it softens. Maybe there's a little tingling or a movement, a deeper breath. And then I say, may I come forward some more? I noticed that you said, okay, that's an interesting word. Is there another word that you think you could use that would help to describe what you would like me to do? Because okay is an interesting word. I say, I think I want to say that's enough. Okay. Or maybe right there. So then I walk forward and they say, they feel something, and then they say right there. And I stop, and then they notice what the feeling is and what it was like to vocalize that. And for me to be right there. And then we go through another cycle of activation, connection, responsiveness, settling, and eventually get to a point where there's a hand gesture, a vocalization, a clear vocalization, a directedness, and a feeling of the ground underneath them. So it's like, that's enough. Stop right there. And we do it standing. I mean, I'm seated here, but it's that feeling of, no, my space. And so this is it's a somatic exercise, and it might come up just organically when someone is talking about something or feeling, whether it's something at work, something with their family, something from the past. Could be interpersonal. It could be a car, right, coming at them. It could be medical trauma, right? Stop right there. Or the feeling of that ability to mobilize and state. So empowerment, right? And there are ways to help people reconnect to that in the physiology and in their bodies in the here and now, so that they can have that be more and more accessible and available to them. So that then when they want it, when they need it, it's there.
And so that's obviously helping them moving forward, but in being able to find that even in that space with you or a therapist of any kind, that's reaching back into time as well. Is that right? Like being able to do something, say something, hold space, hold a boundary that they maybe weren't able to before.
That's right. And so I couldn't then, but I can now. And that's the circuitry in the brain that's sort of, part of neuroplasticity. The brain can change and rewire through life. There's a little bit more when you're younger, but even in adulthood. So we're really rewiring the feeling of that ability to access that, not just cognitively, but once the person feels more empowered in the here and now, and they practice it and they feel it and they can do it with you, then it's more available. If that was kind of stuck in a freeze response, because that's what needed to happen when I was younger, right? That was the way that I survived, or it was so confusing, and there wasn't any way to make sense of what was happening. But now, as you think about that, what are the signals that you feel? So it's a thwarted fight response or a thwarted boundary that then you can re-engage that feeling. So yes, exactly. It usually taps into one of those past patterns and then allows the person to have more full access in the here and now to flexible survival responses, we could call them, to practice those and to feel the connection and the capability and the capacity of those.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just want to emphasize that it's not just a cognition change. It's not just a behavior change or trying on something new, but it really does change our nervous system. And it might take practice, but what happens in the office in that exercise that we'll often do, in that renegotiation, as it seeps in through somebody's whole being, it really is a rewiring, a changing of the nervous system. And that's what we get to bring forward.
I imagine most of us, adults at least, and maybe children as well, have learned or I've gotten to a point of some level of disconnection with the body and, less access to sensations, really being in tune with what's going on in the body. But then I also imagine, which I think was the case with me to a degree, that some of us, due to trauma and maybe activities post-trauma, like numbing activities, alcohol or drugs or whatever is the numbing drug of choice, where I imagine you guys come across clients that are, kind of seemingly so disconnected from their body. It's so hard for them to be aware of and tune into any physical sensations or emotional sensations that are happening in the body. And since this work is seemingly so like that's such an important part of this kind of somatic work, is to be able to tune in with that. What do you do in those cases when you come across somebody who's so disconnected from their body?
I love the question. The first thing I always do is hold the fascination and the awe that this person made it into my office. Wow. I know a little bit when people first come in, and I get to know more and more over time, but wow, you've made it here. You survived. You're here. So I'm always in awe. I tell my students, one of the first things and ongoing things I ask myself is, who is this human being I'm with right now? Their trauma history is second. Who's the human being I'm with? The experience that people have of not feeling their bodies, it's a survival strategy. Who wants to feel if it's going to feel horrible? So I'm out of there. And there's a whole biochemistry that allows for that. One of the ideas with somatic experiencing is to give people sensory motor experiences, exercises, ideas, experiences really, that change what their bodies are doing so they can start to feel something, right? Like the soft tongue earlier, that's an example. It might be, hey, let's tighten everything up and release it. Let's tighten it up and now release it. Just right now, just in this moment right here, but little by little. Because if our bodies are feeling the same thing, sending the same signaling, sensory signaling to the brain all the time, we won't feel it anymore. We won't be aware. So if we can help shift it a little bit, sometimes I'll have somebody just do this. Now, does your left arm feel the same or different than your right arm? Right? Always do the other side or it feels imbalanced.
And if you're on the podcast, Dave's rubbing his arm.
Oh,
Yes, sorry.
that's right. If you don't see me, I'm rubbing my arm. That's right. Just that little change. Oh, now I feel my left arm. In fact, now it's feeling tingly. Oh, now my whole shoulder's relaxing. My left arm, rather. Get confused. So giving sensory motor experiences that change the signaling to the brain, saying, you know what? You're actually right here, right now. You're not back then. Even if it's for 1 second or 2 seconds, that's 1 or 2 seconds more than a day ago or an hour ago, right? And we do it gradually because, again, coming back into felt sense, into the present moment, into the body, too much, too quickly is a great way to re-traumatize people. So we don't, we titrate it, a term borrowed from chemistry, drop, little by little.
Right. Yeah, because the physical sensations can be so overwhelming and so painful. And sometimes I would just sit there and be like, okay, just stay with it, because I couldn't do anything about it. But it is, I don't even have the words to describe how painful it is. So it's interesting that you say that itself can be overwhelming, and try to find ways to notice, okay, there's maybe parts of you that don't feel that way, and increment into it, because it's just your body can be so in so much pain, and your brain can't do anything about it. Like, you can't reason yourself out of this physical pain that you're in with the trauma.
Right. And it might be physical pain, or it might be the emotions that go along with waking up the body that are also, that can also be painful. So differentiating those out, experiencing those. But again, I like the way you said it, increment it up. I like using that I'm going to use that as a verb from now on. Thank you.
Is that even a real?
I love making up words.
All right. I'm just making them up.
That's kind of along the lines of a thought that I had, James, to share with you around that. Pain is a profound experience, and there's a lot of different things that it might connect to. So as Dave was saying, it could be emotional pain, or it could be the constriction around the emotion because it feels so overwhelming. Or it could be the constriction around some of the fight and flight of, I need to flee, but I'm trapped. I need to fight, but I'm trapped. So if we actually start to explore the motor movements, or the procedural, getting too sciencey there, the muscular movements, and the movements in the body of going towards or going away, or armoring up, right? So if you actually feel pain and you feel that as armor, right? Feel that as a defensive armor to constrict against the thing that you don't want. And hold that until your body says, I'm done constricting. And then allow that to soften. So there's different ways that you can enter into these sensory experiences. And sometimes it is too much. And then we'll say, look around the room. Look at the light and the colors. Wiggle your toes. We don't want to also just focus on the trauma. We want to create what Peter Levine talks about, this process of pendulation. It's a movement between fixity and flow, or expansion and contraction. And so you tend to a state, and then you might move away from it, do something different, give new input to the brain and the body, and then notice how things change, right? So if I come away from that pain, I wiggle my toes and I see, I've seen looking at a candle. I rarely look at that candle, but it's there. It's pine scented. And then I have an association to hiking in the forest and the new fallen snow. And as I do that, there's a deeper breath. And when I check back in, I still feel the pain, but I feel some more spaciousness around it. Right? So that's one thing too, which is very different from somatic experiencing and some other somatic modalities as well, where you don't just be mindful of what is. You actually move your attention to some different things to help. Well, we have kind of a process of how to allow the shock physiology to release or discharge, shaking, trembling, heat. There might be movement patterns that needed to happen that can complete in the present moment. Or we begin to move attention away to something that feels better. You can even notice the strength in the legs. I feel pain in my heart, but my legs feel solid and warm. Can you hold both at the same time? And as you do that, then there's a softening, or there's an emotion that starts to move through, right? Or the tears fall, but they're not tears of despair. They're tears of release and relief, right? So these would be some ways to think about touching into the pain, but not having to just kind of drill into it all the time.
Right.
That can actually be re-traumatizing.
Yeah, that's definitely been a huge part of my personal healing experience so far. I've worked with a couple of therapists that are somatic experiencing practitioners. And that piece of being able to, yes, first, tune in with where the uncomfortable or the painful sensation is happening, really slowly lean into it, describe it, learn to become intimate with it at a pace that feels safe enough. But then that piece of being able to then shift or my consciousness to another part of my body, that feels relaxed, that feels comfortable, because as we all know, like when we're having those sort of anxiety ridden or triggered sensations, it can feel so all consuming. It feels like it's the only thing that is happening and there's no way out, so to have that experience that, wow, that kind of discomfort can be happening in one part of my body, and in another part there can be something happening that's really actually enjoyable, so empowering for me. And that I have the ability to move my consciousness, shift my consciousness to that, and then choose to come back if I want, travel back to the uncomfortable sensation back and forth has really been such a game changer for me as well. So just to resonate with what you're saying.
And the ability to have choice, because you've come into your body, you can feel, and now you can choose. Right. That in so many ways is the antithesis of trauma, where you're at the mercy of your survival needs. You're at the moment, it's all or none survival, right? And then that perpetuates over time. But when you can come back in now, now I have choice. I might choose to dissociate. I might choose to feel the pain. I might choose to move away from it now, but I have choice.
Right. It's the empowerment part, having choice, being empowered, even when you're in pain, having power.
Exactly. Yeah.
Along these lines, and talking about sort of the body and the mind and that connection, I want to read this quote from Peter Levine and then ask a question. The quote is, "You don't have to know the facts of your story to be able to reprogram the symptoms or the outcomes." So from the somatic experiencing perspective, or just your individual perspectives, is it not necessary to talk about the traumatic events in one's life in order to heal from them?
I think that it's very useful to have at least a little bit of story. It can't be completely content free. At least over time. It might start out that way because there might be just physical symptoms. I have fibromyalgia and I get headaches, and that's what somebody's coming for. That is the story right now. People may have forgotten a large swath of their history because it's too painful to recall. But then gradually over time, there might be more narrative, more content that's available. We'll find out a little bit more. Or someone might come in knowing a little bit and tell us a little, but we don't need the entire story necessarily, right? We need enough to sort of get the ball rolling a little bit. I mean, it's already rolling. That's why people are in the office, but just to nudge it a little. And then we can let that go. It becomes dispensable. All right. And then work with somebody with this concept of pendulation, embodiment, felt sense, shifting. And then we might go back to a little bit of the narrative, but not very much. So we don't need much.
The somatic work also is very effective with pre-verbal trauma. So, for many of us, it occurs very young. And we might not have our explicit circuitry, so we might not ever know, right, what happened. But there's this, deep sense of we call it the neuroception of mortal life threat, or the neuroception of danger, or the constriction, or the attachment dilemma, right? It shows up even though the person says, I'm not really sure where this is coming from, right? Or I think something happened a long, long time ago, but I'm not exactly sure what it is. And so, but we would explore what the body is doing in the present moment, along with what we were talking about, the survival physiology, what's all dressed up with nowhere to go, and how do we release that, reorganize that. But often people will have some kind of a sense of, I feel like I was invaded, or I think this might connect to some kind of pre-verbal abuse. I'm not sure. And it's okay to not be sure, but explicit, your cognitive, the framing, it can be helpful to have some ideas or thoughts. Certainly with trauma, dissociation is one of the ways that we survive. So it's also very common, like what Dave is saying, you work with a symptom, you start working with somebody, and then the signals in the body occur, and then the person has a flash or a memory, or they reconnect to something that they hadn't seen before or hadn't experienced before, and then they're able to make sense of something. So that narrative sometimes can be very, what I'm going to call, consolidating and helpful for some people. But we ultimately are most interested in a somatic field in helping the person to feel regulated, empowered, and have capacity. So it's not that the pain will ever go away, but it'll shift to where it's more tolerable, or that you're able to hold it in a way where you're not going into high stress physiology, right? Or that you're able to have the capacity to fight, flee, freeze, and then come out of it and return to a relative pocket of safety if you're in a relative pocket of safety, like as we are together sitting here in this moment with one another. So these would be things that we're kind of ultimately engaging the person with. So the memory itself, it's helpful in some ways, but it's not necessary. And it can be kind of, you get that, we call it bottom up and top down, having some top down understanding, having a kind of a feeling of who I am and how this has influenced me, and how I am changing, and how it's hurt, and how it's also formed being an advocate, or doing some of the things that I am passionate about now. Those kinds of things can be very healing. So we don't want to just completely leave cognition out of it. But we're really interested in the bottom up reorganization.
And cognition is malleable. There are even circumstances where eyewitness accounts at crime scenes are questioned because they're malleable. The more times someone hears or tells a story, the more likely it might change. So the content is used to arouse somebody's system, but not to change. And it's already happened. So clients will often ask me, but I want to know what happened. And I'll say, well, it's like going to the store and you want kiwis, but only grapes are available. So grapes are the somatic story, the symptoms, the physiology, et cetera. The kiwis might come later, but it's not about going and filling in the kiwi bin. It's really about tasting the sweetness of the grapes when they ripen.
All of that information seems like it could be, really provide a sense of hope for, a lot of people that, maybe have experienced traumas in some shape or form, and maybe their body or their mind, in order to survive, had to dissociate and had to numb and had to repress these memories. And sometimes, I've talked to people who feel like, if they just have maybe this very abstract idea of something that happened to them, but they can't quite access it, and then this fear that, like, well, if I can't access it, I'm never going to be able to heal it. Right. So both sides of this information, where one, it's not absolutely necessary to, in this case, to have, every detail, to remember, to recall every single detail of what happened, but also that even if one is in that situation of not being able to remember the details of what they went through, that this process of kind of reintroducing them to their body, in a sense, right, and to the sensations in their body, might be one of the keys to kind of rolling that back and being able to reaccess some of that. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that was a lovely summary, really. Okay. Yeah. And to quote our mentor, Dr. Peter Levine, trauma is not a life sentence. It is changeable. We are changeable.
So I'm really curious about you two individually, as far as, what really inspired you to come to this work?
Well, my mind darts to a lot of different moments, because I think it's been a long journey. As many of us find our way into the healing professions, like the archetype of the wounded healer. I started out as a body worker. So I worked as a body worker for many years, and I became really fascinated with how people, when I worked on a certain part of their body, might have a memory or an emotional experience or a release that they hadn't had in 20 years, or something big would start to move through emotionally, or again, they'd have an association. And I started to think about the mind-body connection. And one of my mentors recommended Ram Dass, How Can I Help? And Peter Levine, Waking the Tiger. So I read Waking the Tiger, and it clicked. It clicked for me on a personal level. Oh, this survival physiology, that's something I want to be able to engage with in my own body. So as a body worker, I went into the Somatic Experiencing program quite young, in my mid-20s. And my first Somatic Experiencing session that I had, my whole body started, this was kind of an individual session outside of class, my whole body started to shake. And I kept thinking, I'm cold, I'm cold, I'm cold. And the practitioner I was with said, well, we've just been learning about shock trauma and relational trauma. And, this really could just be your body releasing some stress. And so she came, she touched my feet. I shook some more. I felt waves of heat and cold and all kinds of different experiences rushing through me. And then when I walked outside, I had never seen the stars shining so brightly. My vision had never been that clear. It was like being born, anew, revival into the world. And I had this, where I had had this anxiety and this knot that I think I had for much of my life. I felt kind of a clear, openness. And so that's my personal experience. But I've been now in the work for over 20 years, and seeing time and time again with people that I work with, when we touch into these depths and we reorganize from these primitive levels of our experience, there is this emergence and this sort of renewal that can happen. Sometimes it's very slow. Sometimes it can be 1 or 2 sessions where you really get this kind of larger shifting of a state that happens. So with many, many different kinds of symptoms, people say, oh, do you work with PTSD? Well, that's just one facet of trauma. right? There's so many different ways where we feel overwhelmed. And to quote Dr. Peter Levine too, trauma is not in the event, it's an ongoing signals in the nervous system. Right? So time and time again, I see that this for a lot of people is the missing piece. There are other ways to heal too. People might find there are other ways, but this is often a missing piece. So I shared more from my personal on that one.
Beautiful. Thank you.
That's great.
Yeah. Mine was a little different. When I was a child at some point in time, and I was only recalling this not too long ago, I had this thought, I had this realization that there was something about me having in my life, almost like a purpose in my life around helping with people with pain. And it was like this fleeting thought when I was a kid. I had my first very conscious in-body experience when I was about 15 years old. I went bike hosteling with the American Youth Hostels, and we were in Vermont, pedaling up this very long mountain road and struggling. And something inside of me said, don't pay attention to the riding. Just feel your legs with your breathing. And I did that. And it changed everything. It was like riding up the hill was not hard. I had a similar experience in soccer a couple of years later, and yoga in the 70s. I was in a yoga class in college in the 70s, and that brought me into my body, which also brought me out of my body at the same time in a pleasant way. And I was yanked back in. And all these experiences, once I've sort of put on a bookshelf and said, these are going to be important. I don't know just how. And I ended up going to graduate school at Stanford in physical therapy. And after I graduated, I worked at a big rehab center, actually here in Houston. And there was one particular patient I worked with. I was on a brain injury team. So looking at trauma from a physical perspective, brain injury. And he was maybe 10 or 12 years old. And he was very agitated one day and just laid down on the floor and wouldn't do anything. And here I am as a physical therapist. I'm supposed to get something physical accomplished. So I just laid down next to him. And we were looking at each other for about a half an hour on the floor, this big physical therapy gym. Part of me is thinking, what is everybody thinking? And part of me didn't care. And at the end of that time, he got up and he walked better than he'd walked coming in. He'd walked better since he'd had the head injury, and he wasn't agitated anymore. I thought, that's very interesting. I didn't do anything. Another experience on the shelf. Later, my work started, so that was physical therapy. I started studying a lot of different kinds of body work and had experiences of my own and with clients where emotions would come up seemingly out of nowhere. And I went back to another graduate program in psychology, specifically somatic psychology. And it was in that program, this is 1993 now, so a very long time ago, in some long weekend additional workshops where I met Peter Levine and Somatic Experiencing. I thought, oh, this is why we studied the nervous system and the autonomic nervous system in physical therapy school. But now it's applied in a completely different way. So in a very intellectual and clinical way, it made complete sense to me. Mm-hmm. And started really steeping myself in understanding this interface between psychology and bodywork and physical therapy and on and on and on, and had many SE sessions. And one really stands out for me. I had Tourette syndrome as a kid, and it wasn't severe, but it certainly was apparent. And it was a session with Peter Levine where he had me go, again, no story. I had no clue why, when, where, etc. So we're working just with the movement patterns. And at the end of that session, everything just smoothed out. And I really was a different person in so many, many, many ways. And that just keeps coming back around in working with clients, with teaching students and doing demo sessions at trainings and in my own work with other practitioners and with myself, that we just keep evolving and changing. And, during certain very stressful times, a little motor thing will come out, or, yeah, do I get stressed out? Yeah. Do I go into a trauma response? I might, but I can feel it. I can feel it happening. And let me come back into the present moment. Oh, this is what's going on. Okay. So it's not locked in. It's not a life sentence anymore.
Amazing how our life sets us up with these all these experiences we need, and these little drips of experiences and knowledge to then be able to hold and receive and apply the information at the right time. How all those puzzle pieces work together.
Wondering what you would say to someone who's been traumatized and has lost all hope of feeling better.
I think the first thing I would do is come into my own body, come into me. Because if I'm not present, if I get swept up into the hopelessness, that doesn't help anybody. That's two people, one rowboat, no oars, no anchor, somewhere in the middle of the ocean. So I'm here, feel me, and listen. I'd spend time with them first, listening. Who is this human being I'm with? Wow, they got here. And I'm holding that container. And I would probably say something like, I get it. And let's see if we can help you shift that a little bit at a time.
So I had a similar experience to Dave but I kind of felt my heart. I felt my legs. So I think coming into a felt sense of attunement, being available for the connection, whether it's somebody who's listening to the podcast or here on the webinar, you're here. So already there's agency, or someone comes to my office, already there's agency of a desire to want to heal on some level. That's very different than hopelessness. There's actually an action that's taking place towards. So I would probably just have some time to recognize there's some level of energy or motivation that's happening, even though hopelessness, right, is a deep sense of shutdown. Usually there's a freeze state, like a dorsal vagal collapse, right, around in the physiology. So I'd say, I would really like to teach you some ways to work with the freeze. Let's not talk about, and we would want to hear their history and connect with the person in front of me. And, you create a relational rapport. That's one of the ways that we're hardwired to heal. But a lot of the time, people can't even sense into the relationship until they come out of freeze. Their bodies are more in that lockdown state. So we could do some very gentle somatic exercises, whether it's orienting to the space, moving the toes, talking about some hard things, coming out for a while and not talking about hard things, right? Noticing when maybe we nod together. How is it just to nod with me? Or if I look at Wade's beautiful environment, right, and shirt, that, there could be a moment, right, where somebody comes out and has some kind of appreciation or something that's not trauma. So we also want to teach the brain to attend to that. And then the other thing that I would be doing as we're exploring whatever it is I'm going to be tracking their physiology for when they are coming out of the freeze, or when there's a slight shift towards betterness. I'm not going to invite them to track the freeze, track or follow. I'm going to invite them to notice, if they can, when they're slowly out of it. If they can't notice that, I'll just keep doing some of the things that are beginning to reinstate rhythm in the nervous system, whether it's through what we're doing or what we're speaking about. So I would encourage the person to have hope that we're going to engage in a process that will move the freeze physiology, and to reframe it that that's what animals do in the wild in order to protect themselves. And we have this natural capacity to come out of it. It can take time, especially if it happens early, right? As Dave was saying, there could be a lot of around those conflicting impulses with attachment or there's this slow change that needs to happen. Like attachment isn't changed quickly. It's little by little over a long period of time, because it constellates over a long period of time. But we can shift it. We're adaptable. We have everything that we need inside of us on that instinctual level to begin to move through. So I try to offer some of that hope and then give them the experience of the shift. So it's not just talking. It's something that is actually shifting a little bit. And sometimes in the beginning, it doesn't feel like it's enough. They say, Dr. Abi, yeah, okay, I took a deeper breath, but so what?
Mm-hmm.
I know it doesn't feel like enough. Or yes, I'm going to ask you that annoying question about if you notice, as you're looking at the trees, what you might be feeling inside. Or maybe I don't even say that. I'll say, as you look at the trees, it looks like something has shifted. And I don't even invite them to go inside. It's just kind of a general observation. Yeah. But over time, that begins to move the state. And so for those of you who are listening, who may feel like giving up hope, I encourage you to, as you're doing now, keep listening to podcasts, keep connecting to people who you feel kinship with. Explore all of these different possibilities, because there are many ways to heal. And we do ultimately have a lot of this very deep healing wisdom that's just part of our blueprint.
Wow. Thank you both so much for first just being you, right? For all of the work that you're doing in the world and the help that you're providing through people through your individual practice and your work with these organizations and your training, and just it's such a service. And we're really grateful.
Thank you for taking the time to speak with us.
You're so very welcome. Thank you for inviting us. This has been a pleasure.
And also just recognition for the two of you for the healing work that you're doing in the world, and advocacy and support and opening the conversations. And it's really an honor to be with you, fellow healers on the path.
Thank you.
And all the listeners as well.
I'm going to cry. I don't know. Just okay. Thank you. This is From Trauma
to Triumph.